Sorry about the delays. Thank you for your patience. Thank you also to the colleagues who I have on the title of this presentation. They haven't actually seen this presentation, but I've done a lot of work at the Western Treatment Plant with them, and they helped me form the ideas that I'm going to present here today. I'll start off with a definition of a supratidal wetland. A supratidal wetland is simply a wetland above the level of normal high tides. They're often constructed by people, and they fringe thousands of kilometres of the coastline of the East Asian-Australasian Flyway. Some supratidal wetlands are fantastic sites for birds. I've shown here Port Leslie Saltworks in northwestern Australia, Australia's best site for broad-billed sandpiper and Asian dowitcher. The Western Treatment Plant, a stronghold for curlew sandpipers, which I'll talk about later today. But most of the supratidal wetlands along this flyway are most of them are aquaculture, and most of them aren't great for shorebirds, at least not for foraging shorebirds. But as the previous speaker showed, if they were managed correctly, could be very good. This is my study site, the Western Treatment Plant. It treats over it's in Australia, in Victoria. It treats over half of Melbourne's sewage. Note the scale bar. It's a very big place. It's 105 square kilometres in total. Covers about 15 kilometres of shoreline. The shoreline is lined by tidal flats, but they're not like Asian tidal flats. These are very narrow tidal flats. At most they're 100 to 300 metres wide. The tidal range is very small. It's less than a metre. But although these tidal flats are small, they have a lot of food and they have a lot of shorebirds, mostly these three species: redneck stint, curlew sandpiper, sharp-tailed sandpiper. On the land, that's the Western Treatment Plant itself. It's managed by Melbourne Water, who do a great job of looking after the shorebird habitat they've got. Most of the sewage farm is sewage treatment ponds. They're quite deep, they're permanent, they're not shorebird habitat. But the ponds that I've marked in sort of purplish red, conservation ponds, they're managed especially for their conservation values and mainly for shorebirds. This is an example here. So basically they keep the ponds full for most of the year, but then they draw the levels down when shorebirds need them in our summer. With its small tidal flats and its excellent network of tracks, the Western Treatment Plant's a really good place to count shorebirds. We've been counting shorebirds there for 40 years, and for the last 20 years we've been counting them at both high tide and low tide. And for many years, the high tide counts and the low tide counts came out virtually identical, which was good. But in the last 5 years, we've been getting far more shorebirds at low tide than we did at high tide. So an indication that shorebirds are going somewhere new at high tide. So we've been looking into that, and we think that the movement patterns have changed. So these maps below, the red dots indicate where shorebirds feed at low tide. The yellow arrows indicate the flights they take to roost sites at high tide, and the width of the arrows is scaled to the number of birds that make that movement. Before 2004, from 2004 to 2015, shorebirds used to scatter between a number of different conservation ponds within the Western Treatment Plant, which is, the boundaries are marked by those blue dots. Since then, in recent years, most redneck stints and curlew sandpipers and sharp-tailed sandpipers have started to leave the Western Treatment Plant at high tide. They're flying 15 kilometres to another shorebird site, Avalon Saltfields, and several roost sites in the treatment plant are barely used anymore. So it indicates that there's been a change in quality of the conservation ponds in the treatment plant. This sounds bad. It shouldn't be taken as a criticism of Melbourne Water. They're doing an absolutely wonderful job at the treatment plant, but managing shallow ponds is difficult. And we think they've got a problem that's been faced in many other sites of vegetation encroachment in the conservation ponds. This is a pond that's an example from the Western Treatment Plant. 5 years before this photo was taken, the pond had just been constructed. It was all bare mud and shallow water. The whole surface area of it could be used by shorebirds. All this vegetation grew in 5 years. In this particular pond, it's salt marsh, which is very tolerant to flooding. So we're going to be stuck with the salt marsh for a long time. It's good for orange-bellied parrots, but bad for shorebirds. Anyway, the question we have is, how can we improve the conservation ponds at the treatment plant? And particularly, are we just trying to provide more habitat where shorebirds can rest safely and sleep at high tide? Or do we need to provide them with habitat where shorebirds can actually feed at high tide? And that's the focus of this talk. So if we just want them to feed at high tide, then there's lots of simple and cheap management options. For example, we could put in floating roosts where the birds could go to. They can just rest there when the tide is high. But if we want the birds to actually feed during high tide, then we have to manage the whole pond. There's ongoing costs because we've got to manage the water levels and control the vegetation. Ways to look at this. A very simple way to start is to look at shorebird species composition at the Western Treatment Plant. It's summarised in this graph, which shows that the shorebird community of the treatment plant is dominated by generalist species, which can forage. They forage readily either on tidal flats or in inland wetlands. There's 3 species that are particularly common at the treatment plant: redneck stint, curlew sandpiper and sharp-tailed sandpiper. They absolutely dominate the numbers there. Shorebird species that are normally found on inland wetlands, such as banded stilts and red-knee dotterels and so on, are not particularly common at the Western Treatment Plant, although we have some. And coastal obligate species, which only feed on tidal flats, like knots and bar-tailed godwits, are very uncommon indeed at the treatment plant. And the graph shows how it's not just, it is specific to the treatment plant, it's different to the rest of Victoria in that respect. Incidentally, there's references at the bottom of the presentation if anyone wants to find my sources on some things. A second way we can look at the importance of the ponds to shorebirds foraging at the treatment plant is to actually look at the birds and see if they're foraging. So every shorebird count we do at the treatment plant, we record the proportion of birds or the number of birds that are feeding. And the simple answer to the question there is yes, lots of shorebirds forage while they're in the conservation ponds of the treatment plant. But are their foraging attempts successful? That's difficult because they eat very small prey. It's very hard to measure intake rate directly. And we do know that the biomass of food that's available to shorebirds in the ponds is not nearly as high as it is on the tidal flats. That's what the 2 graphs on the bottom right are about. You can luckily do a you can estimate energy intake using a combination of existing foraging theory from Goss Custard and tide data, which is freely available from our Bureau of Meteorology. So if you go through this stream of calculations, you get the numbers that I've come up with in the table. So in the table, as an example, redneck stints need to eat 10.5 grams of benthos per day. That's wet weight. And it's equivalent to 38% of their body mass. When they're fattening up for migration, they actually have to eat more than their body mass every day to fuel successfully. So they need a lot of food. There's a cap to how quickly shorebirds can take food in. They can only swallow a certain amount of food at a time. Their digestive tracts can't work faster than a certain rate. Goss Custard's model helps you calculate that cap to intake rate. And if you know that, then you can approximately calculate the foraging time that birds need to meet their daily energy target. It's expressed here as, I'm sorry, when did I go offline?
You've been fine, Danny, it's working fine for me.
Oh, okay, sorry, that's just a message. So the final column in that table gives you the percentage of the day that shorebirds need to forage to meet their energy needs at the treatment plant. So for curlew sandpipers, they need to forage for 44% of the day. The tricky thing is, if they're feeding on tidal flats, the tidal flats are covered by the tides for half the day. But the extent to which they're covered and the duration for which they're covered is actually affected by the tides. During neap tides, when the gravitational pull of the sun and the moon are counteracting each other, the tidal flats are not exposed for very long at all. And so you would predict that they can't meet their energy requirements at that time. But this is based on theory. Is there any empirical support for it? Yes, there is, because the Victorian Wader Study Group has been weighing redneck stints at the Western Treatment Plant for a long, long time. And we can compare their weights on neap tides versus spring tides. And basically, the higher the previous low tide was, so the more neapy the tide series is, the lower the weight of the birds is. They lose weight during neap tides, then they put on a bit of weight at spring tides. During neap tides, they can't get enough food. So our conclusions are, foraging in the supratidal ponds of the treatment plant is very important indeed to some shorebird species. Not just as roosts, they've got to be foraging sites. It's most important during neap tides, and if anywhere in the world you want to know you're asking this question, I'd first look at the neap tides. That's when shorebirds are likely to be constrained in what they can get out of tidal flats. And neither the tidal flats or the conservation ponds of the treatment plant are particularly amazing in themselves, but the fact that you've got them close together is what makes the Western Treatment Plant a really fabulous shorebird site. I'll finally point out that these generalizations don't apply to all species. They definitely work for the 3 species I've been talking about today, but there are some shorebird species like knots and bar-tailed godwits that are coastal obligates. They hardly ever forage in non-tidal ponds, and it's very likely they're specialized to eat prey that only occurs in tidal flats. So you can supratidal ponds, great management opportunity, but not for everything. I had a final slide. I think I've got enough time, so I might.
Yes, that's fine. 2 more minutes. Thank you. Yep.
Yeah. So I just had some final thoughts on how you should make supratidal ponds suitable for foraging shorebirds, which may be relevant to Mei-ling. And this is based on our studies at Werribee. Most importantly, they've got to have food for shorebirds, which is actually not that hard. It's natural for invertebrates to colonize shallow water bodies unless they're way too salty or they have a concrete bottom or something. So generally, wetlands will develop food for shorebirds. But the food has to be accessible. So the main thing for shorebirds is the water has to be shallow. And the graph shows foraging depths for different shorebird species at the treatment plant. Every species has a very narrow range of water depths in which it likes to feed. Between them, they cover the whole bit. But all these species in the graph, they were all foraging on the same thing, chironomid larvae, but very distinct differences in the depths they foraged at. The third principle is shorebirds don't like tall things. We've measured it at the treatment plant. They prefer to feed at least 30 meters away from objects that are taller than they are. Some birds will let you forage within 10 meters, but most like to be 30 meters away. And the challenge in freshwater wetlands is that vegetation almost always develops in wetlands where water levels are permanently shallow. So you've just got to keep them shallow for quite a short period, or you're going to have a vegetation problem. And finally, if you're going to maintain ponds for foraging shorebirds, because of that vegetation problem, you're committing yourself to ongoing management. You just can't do some earthworks and say, that's it, it's a foraging site. You're going to have to look at it every year to make sure that you've got the water levels under control, the vegetation under control, and that shorebirds are still using it and foraging at it. And that's everything. Thank you.